New York City, April 30th, 1789. The inaugural. George Washington places his hand on a Bible and takes the oath of office as President of the United States of America. 4 future presidents would take the oath on that same book.
I, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush.
Today, you can see that Bible at Federal Hall in New York City, the site of that first swearing in. To think that his hand touched that.
Yes, and not only that, his lips actually kissed the pages in that book.
National Park Service Ranger Ed Pennell says this Bible was actually an afterthought.
Everything is prepared for the event. Soldiers were in their best uniform. City officials were in place to receive him. They come to a point where they're about to give the oath and there's no Bible.
The nearest Bible they could find from St. John's Masonic Lodge No. 1. Yes, Masonic as in Freemasons, a fraternal order known for charity, fellowship, and secrecy. 14 U.S. presidents were members, including George Washington. He's obviously held in particularly high esteem here. I mean, he's gold.
Oh, indeed, indeed.
Piers Vaughn is master of St. John's Lodge, which still owns that Bible. He and 2 fellow Masons carried the Bible, it must always be escorted by 3, back to their lodge so that we could take a closer look.
This is the page on which George Washington placed his hand as he took the oath of office.
Geez, you've opened this many times, and each time do you imagine him putting his hand?
Absolutely.
Vaughn doesn't believe the Bible was some last-minute fill-in.
Now, we know that George Washington was a very devout man. It seems inconceivable that he wouldn't have thought of using a Bible.
But why this Bible?
If they used a Bible which was associated with any particular church or denomination, that church would immediately declare itself the official religion of the United States of America.
The Masonic Bible, in a sense, transcended denomination.
Exactly.
The story goes that Washington took the oath on a random page. But Vaughn thinks Washington intentionally selected a passage from Genesis, Jacob blessing his 12 sons. Where Jacob blesseth his sons.
Yes.
But the father blesses his children. Where the father of our country took the oath.
Exactly. And that's why it just seems to be too much, to be a random
An
page.
accident. If the Bible had been randomly opened, where would it likely have been opened?
Let's go here. And so now
oh my gosh,
Job,
the
there
book
you go.
of Job.
The book of Job. Cheerful reading.
Yes, the book of Job. The one filled with disease, destruction, and death. And that's not a very good foot to get off on.
Probably not.
Thankfully, our new country fared much better. And so did this Bible, said to be present with Washington at the groundbreaking of the U.S. Capitol, and later at his funeral.
In a way, you could say it was on that book that the executive branch of government was created.
In New York's Hudson Valley, in the village of Kinderhook, sits a lovely estate called Lindenwold, once home to Martin Van Buren. And if you don't know who that is, you're in good company.
What is something you know about Martin Van Buren, if anything?
He was a president.
He was a president. Thank you.
Eighth president of the United States. Right.
Eighth president.
1840, I think.
1837. Yes, Martin Van Buren was our 8th president, and the first to be born an American citizen, which is more than guide Zach Anderson knew when he applied for a job here.
So I had to kind of admit to my boss over the phone that I was only 85% certain that he was even a president. So it was not my proudest shining moment. Old Kinderhook.
Ranger Zach has since become an expert on the man nicknamed Old Kinderhook. He's the only president who...
He is the only president who spoke Dutch as his first language.
Ding.
One of only 2 presidents to never serve in the military or attend college.
Who's the other?
Other would be Grover Cleveland.
Ding.
He holds the record for being tied for second shortest American president. I know, tied. He stands at 5'6" with Monroe, and then Madison takes the crown for being shortest of 5'4".
But in the facial hair department, Martin Van Buren is second to no one.
This is actually Martin Van Buren's shaving stand. It is original. He has some of the wildest facial hair to ever grace the White House.
At Lindenwold, they call them not mutton chops, but Martin chops. Let's talk about those. Sideburns doesn't do it justice. They really defy gravity.
Right. They are remarkable. They stretch out. If he couldn't claim vertical space, he's claiming some horizontal space.
Historian Ted Widmer wrote a biography of Martin Van Buren.
I was attracted to the idea of trying to make an obscure president a little bit less obscure. And I think I succeeded in that very small goal. I don't think I made him famous. In fact, it's 15 years since I wrote the book, and you are the first people to have found me.
That's what we're here for. That's our beat.
So thank you.
So there I am.
Van Buren did enjoy a brief moment in the pop culture spotlight on Seinfeld.
I'm taking on the entire Van Buren boys. Van Buren boys? Yeah. There's a street gang named after President Martin Van Buren? Oh, yeah, and they're just as mean as he was.
I'll just do the secret sign briefly. That's the 8 fingers for the 8th president.
Well, what does that mean? They thought I was a former Van B boy.
I'm not allowed to talk anymore about it because it's such a secretive society.
Understood. But Widmer says in office, Van Buren was more than a punchline.
Van Buren deserves credit for inventing our two-party system, which is nowhere in the founding documents. And in fact, the founders, most of them, said it would be a terrible thing if we had parties. And Van Buren comes along and says, no, these are a positive good. When one party gets too powerful, it's good to have the other party start to rise up again.
Although he may have seemed to the manor born, Van Buren was actually the son of a tavern keeper. A striver, he rose quickly through the ranks, senator, secretary of state, and then vice president to the original populist president, Andrew Jackson. Their personalities, at least their images, could not be more different.
That's right. Van Buren, he's short and sort of stout. Jackson is tall and emaciated and kind of a Clint Eastwood sort of tough guy. Van Buren is much more of a politician, and he knows everybody in Washington in a way that Andrew Jackson does not. So Van Buren was better at going out and talking over politics and getting the Jacksonian program through Congress, which is a part of being a successful president.
So why is Martin Van Buren considered such a mediocre president? Well, you might say it was the economy, stupid. Just weeks after taking the oath of office, the Panic of 1837 set in, a financial crisis that triggered a 6-year depression.
It's incredible how fast he fell, given how high he had climbed up.
It was during his administration that Van Buren purchased his lavish for the time home, with one of the very first, and certainly most attractive, presidential flush toilets. That toilet bowl is gorgeous.
It is. It's very unique, very different than what you're used to nowadays.
This was considered very fancy.
Definitely, yes. To have indoor plumbing, it was almost kind of unheard of.
The house is called Lindenwold. Maybe it should be called Martin-a-Lago. A hand-painted toilet bowl, it's just a little over the top.
It's a little over the top. It did not set well with the American public, and that probably was the nail in the coffin for his failed re-election attempt come 1840.
After which Martin Van Buren returned home to entertain and hold court in his capacious dining room.
This is actually the only room left in the house with the original wallpaper still on the walls.
That is just not something to breeze past.
Definitely
Wallpaper that's been up for about 180 years.
For sure.
FYI, if you want your home to look like Martin Van Buren's, this wallpaper is still available from Zubair, the manufacturer. Wait until the end of this segment before you log on to get your own.
Yes.
Van Buren would run for the White House 2 more times, both times unsuccessfully. He'd travel extensively in Europe, write his autobiography, and enjoy farming, fishing, and his family. In 1862, at age 79, Martin Van Buren died, by most accounts, content.
I thought he made a good point, which is that you can have a dismal presidency and a successful life.
Who's the president who delivered the longest inaugural speech in history and served the shortest time in office? William Henry Harrison may not be first to the hearts of his countrymen, but he's a favorite in presidential trivia contests.
He was the only president whose wife, after the White House was born, never made it into the White House. Poor Mrs. Harrison was still packing back in Ohio when he died.
New York Times columnist Gail Collins is the author of a book about our 9th president. Harrison's time in office may have been a trifling 31 days, but his road to the White House is legendary. The campaign of 1840 is actually quite modern.
Very modern. I mean, it's even more modern than we are sometimes.
Oh, who has heard the great commotion, motion, motion?
There were songs.
It is the ball a-rolling on for Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Plenty of spin, merchandising, and
He had the first campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Harrison was an Army general, nicknamed the Hero of Tippecanoe after the site of an Indian battle. But, Collins points out,
all of his victories involved him having way, way, way more people than the other side.
A mere technicality. Harrison was likable and had no strong political beliefs, a perfect candidate for the newly formed Whigs. And he looked like a president.
He looked sort of presidential. He was very sort of tall and thin and, you know, good posture. And
a great nose also.
Great nose, very Roman kind of thing.
But Harrison's ticket to the White House was an anti-Harrison editorial that derided him as a crotchety old soldier drinking hard cider in a log cabin. In a brilliant act of political jujitsu, the Harrison campaign embraced the caricature.
Join the run for Harrison, log cabin and hard cider.
Replica log cabins stocked with hard cider appeared at Harrison campaign stops everywhere. His opponent, Martin Van Buren, was tarred as the rich out-of-touch guy. Ironic, since Harrison was actually born here, a plantation in Virginia. Nope, not a splinter of truth to the log cabin story.
We see this still today, that there's a desire, if you happen to be an aristocrat running for public office, to make yourself seem like one of the people.
The public bought the image and everything associated with it. 80% of eligible voters turned out, a record to this day. At a time when life expectancy was just 39 and a half years old, William Henry Harrison was sworn in at age 68. It would be like 110 today.
Yeah, something amazing. He was very hale and hearty.
And to prove it, William Harrison delivered a 2-hour speech on his inauguration day, in the rain, without an overcoat. He dropped dead 31 days later.
He's a great lesson in bringing an umbrella.
An umbrella and wearing a hat?
And not making a 2-hour speech. In general, I think we could rally around the idea of not making a 2-hour speech anywhere, under any circumstances.
Earlier, we told you about our 9th president, William Henry Harrison, nicknamed Tippecanoe, one half of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Now it's time to hear about the Tyler half. Thank you so much for having me here.
It's our pleasure, Mo.
This is Sherwood Forest, the plantation of John Tyler, Harrison's running mate, who became president after Harrison dropped dead.
Now, this was a campaign poster for William Henry Harrison and John Tyler.
If Painey and Harrison Tyler seem especially at home here, there's a reason. You, sir, are President John Tyler's
grandson.
Not great-grandson.
Grandson.
Yup, you heard right. President John Tyler was born the year after George Washington took the oath of office. So how can he have a living grandson?
Well, my grandfather was born in 1790. My father was born in 1853, and I was born in 1928.
3 generations spanning 222 years and counting. How old was President Tyler when your father was born?
He was 63 years old at that time. And then my father was 75 when I was born. And now I'm 83, 84, whichever it is. And so that's how we get to where we are.
The Tylers are related to seemingly everyone in Virginia's historic Tidewater region. Thomas Jefferson, Presidents Benjamin and William Henry Harrison, and at least half a dozen Jamestown settlers.
And of course, I'm descended from Pocahontas, which goes back before Jamestown.
Of course, not everyone named Tyler is related. Do you think that you're related to Steven Tyler? Or you're not a fan of American Idol or Aerosmith?
That's the biggest looking jerk I ever laid eyes on.
Harrison, you don't want to say that. Cut that out and let's try again.
Well, I'm going to say the same thing.
John Tyler established the precedent that a VP succeeds a president on his death. Yet he's the only president not to be officially mourned in Washington. When Tyler died during the Civil War, he was a member of the Confederate Congress. I'm looking for the resemblance here.
No.
They may not look alike, but there is that distinctive family trait. Forgive me if this sounds a little indelicate, but I mean, for a man to sire a child in his 60s and then another man to sire a child in his 70s, and this is pre-Viagra. I mean, that's extraordinary. Those are great genes.
Dr. Tyler had a third son by this marriage when he was 81.
If you had a child now...
Those were second wives. I'm still the first.
But I must say, the two of you look fantastic, and I can't lie, it would be awesome if you had a kid. Another one.
Thank you so much. That's very kind.
Well, Painty, I'm ready.
Don't ask me.
No, I'm not ready.
We'll get another candidate for that.
I'm not ready. No.
Thank you for the compliment, though. That's quite lovely of you.
At Washington's National Portrait Gallery, all of America's presidents are immortalized. Father of his country, George Washington. The great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln. And Millard Fillmore. Okay, what's so funny? The name. Why does it make people laugh?
Because it's an odd name.
I think people chuckle at Millard. It's just a weird name.
It's the Millard more than the Fillmore.
I think so.
I think it's a combination. Fillmore, I mean, it sounds like a gasoline tank.
It sounds like a sack of potatoes. Does Millard Fillmore deserve to be remembered for more than having a silly name? The folks in his hometown of East Aurora, New York, just outside of Buffalo, certainly think so. Millard built this home for his bride Abigail in 1825.
This actually is called the honeymoon cottage.
Volunteer tour guide Kathy Frost.
It is the only house in the entire nation that is built and lived in by a president. No other home has that distinction.
Millard Fillmore built these floors. So we are walking on the same floor
as Millard did, as Abigail did.
Even the kitchen table.
It's a great table. Yeah.
Where Millard Fillmore's actual teacup still sits. So Millard Fillmore's lips were on that teacup?
Yes.
Do you think that there's still DNA there?
I think so. I think it could be.
And then there's this one-of-a-kind presidential appliance. So was this Millard Fillmore's noodle roller?
No, I cannot tell you that that was Millard Fillmore's noodle roller.
But this is a period noodle roller that Millard Fillmore would have used.
That is correct.
Visitors to the Millard Fillmore house have come from 38 different states and beyond.
China, Korea, and Cuba.
Cuba? Mm-hmm. Someone escaped from Cuba just to see the Millard Fillmore house.
It was on his bucket list.
Modest though the house may be, it's a long way from Fillmore's first home, a tiny log cabin.
His cradle was actually a maple sap trough. Talk about humble, right?
Oh, so it was like a log, basically?
Yes.
A scooped out log?
Yes.
Wow. A loving husband, good with his hands, self-taught and self-made. But then there's his record as president. To appease the South before the Civil War, he signed the notorious Fugitive Slave Act into law, mandating that slaves who'd escaped to the North be forcibly returned to their owners. But in East Aurora, they'd rather look at the glass half Fillmored.
What he signed was the Compromise of 1850, which was a series of bills. One small bill in that compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act.
Are you spinning for Millard Fillmore? Are you a Fillmore apologist?
I'm a Fillmore groupie.
Has history been unfair to Millard Fillmore?
I believe it has.
Aurora historian Robert Goller. His chief accomplishments.
He lowered the price of the postage stamp.
Goller says Millard matters.
We hear about Lincoln and Lincoln and Lincoln, but Fillmore played just as much of a part in the nation's role in the Civil War as Lincoln did, just not as prominent.
So there he is.
There he is, Millard Fillmore.
Fillmore biographer Paul Finkelman. You wrote a book about Millard Fillmore.
Yes.
Why?
Lincoln was taken, Jefferson was taken, Fillmore was available.
Where would you like to see Millard Fillmore ranked among presidents?
He's now 7th or 8th from the bottom, and I hope my book puts him back where he belongs in the bottom 5. He's bigoted against Catholics, he's bigoted against Jews, he hates blacks. During the Civil War, he basically supports the Confederacy by the end of the war.
But Fillmore did lower the price of the postage stamp.
He did lower the price of the postage stamp. Mazel tov.
Okay, he was a terrible president, but it turns out a not-so-bad city father, which Buffalonians commemorate every year on Millard Fillmore's birthday.
As you're aware, he served UB as its chancellor for nearly 30 years.
University at Buffalo professor Claude Welch delivered this year's Millard Fillmore address.
He was involved with the creation of the Buffalo Fine Arts Academy, which we know up there as the Albright Knox.
How do Buffalonians feel about Millard Fillmore?
Actually, we feel a sense of pride.
Although
he's going to be a person that, unless politics change very dramatically, isn't going to rise much in terms of presidential standings.
Do you feel a little bit guilty saying that right here?
Millard, do you mind?
But over in East Aurora, the whole town, it seems, turns out for Millard Fillmore's birthday party. Even Millard himself.
Now, I see you have some wine here. You know that I was a teetotaler.
And this year, a surprise guest. Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius, who bears a striking resemblance to town historian Rob Goller.
And she came to basically do some damage control on the healthcare.gov website. But don't sign up now. You won't get very far, but we appreciate your patience.
This kind of a thing doesn't happen at Mount Vernon or Monticello.
Oh no, oh no. Everybody!
In Buffalo, they put it all into perspective. Millard Fillmore may not have been a great president, or even a good president, and he does have a funny name, but he's their president, and that's something to embrace. Sort of. Is it fair to say Millard Fillmore is a pride of Buffalo?
I'm not sure we would say he's as much of a pride as our chicken wings or beef on weck.
All right, okay, well now, all right, so he goes chicken wings, beef on weck, Millard Fillmore. No survey of our worst presidents would be complete without our 14th president, Franklin Pierce, the only president from New Hampshire.
The funny thing is people from New Hampshire don't really like him that much, so.
Joan Woodhead is president of the Pierce Brigade.
We have a shirt that belonged to Franklin Pierce, and you can see it says F. Pierce.
Founded in 1966 to rescue Concord, New Hampshire's Pierce Manse from destruction and to salvage the reputation of the man who once lived here. He was known as a really good-looking president, is that right?
Yes, he was. Harry Truman thought he was the most handsome president we had in the White House up until his time.
But why is Harry Truman the arbiter of good-looking presidents?
Well, I don't know. That's the only comment we have from another president.
He may have been the most handsome man ever to serve in the White House.
And, says University of Virginia's Michael Holt, Franklin Pierce had a great personality.
He was probably the most amiable president we've ever had. Even historians who are hostile to him remark about how pleasant and friendly he was.
At Bowdoin College, he began a lifelong friendship with the future great American novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne. Hawthorne would write Pierce's campaign biography.
It's probably not as interesting as some of his novels.
Right. It's no Scarlet Letter.
No, it's no Scarlet Letter. Thank God for that, right?
Injured after falling off his horse during the Mexican-American War, Pierce, a Democrat, served in both houses of Congress. A compromise candidate, he won his party's nomination for the presidency on the 49th ballot.
We poked you in 44, we shall pierce you in 52.
That is a great slogan.
Yes, it is.
Pierce was elected in a landslide. What good things did he do in office? While Professor Holt composes himself, let's return to the Pierce Manse, where we learn about Pierce's reforms to the Postal Service. Stamps were perforated under Pierce.
Right, so that it was easier for people to separate the stamps.
Yeah, he's the postage stamp guy.
Gary Sparks is a volunteer guide at the Manse.
He also helped ensure that American farmers had a goodly supply of guano.
Guano?
Guano, yeah.
The Guano Islands Act of 1856, signed into law by Pierce, scooped up the rights to unclaimed islands rich with guano, a.k.a. bird poop. A natural fertilizer prized at the time by American farmers. FYI, Midway, site of a pivotal battle in World War II, is one of those islands. So did this result in the mass importation of guano?
It resulted in a good steady flow of guano, yeah.
So why then does Pierce have such a crappy reputation?
Because he played a major role in bringing on the Civil War.
There's that. In 1854, Pierce signed into law the Kansas-Nebraska Act, allowing voters in the Kansas and Nebraska territories to decide whether to allow slavery within their borders, negating the earlier Missouri Compromise, which had prohibited slavery in those areas.
He made a terrible mistake in endorsing the Kansas-Nebraska Act and then jumping in with both feet on the pro-Southern side.
In Kansas, violence broke out between pro- and anti-slavery forces in a kind of preview of the Civil War. And the outrage in northern states was so intense, it led to the creation of the Republican Party.
He thought making concessions to Southerners was what was necessary to preserve the Union.
Not even Pierce's hometown could forgive him for the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
They burned him in effigy in Concord because of his pro-Southern actions.
Pierce's political woes could only be matched by his personal ones. All three of his and his wife Jane's children died young. 11-year-old Benny, the last surviving one, killed in a train accident traveling with his parents just 2 months before Pierce's inauguration. The grief was almost more than First Lady Jane Pierce could bear.
Sort of went into mourning, draping the White House in black, and really didn't come out in public until almost the end of 1854, to almost 2 full years into the administration.
After a single term in office, Pierce sought renomination, but was rejected by his party. He returned to New Hampshire in 1857 to a home that later burned down. Only the front steps of this house remain. After Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, every house on this stretch, except Pierce's, displayed an American flag in commemoration of the great emancipator. An angry mob assembled, asking why Pierce wasn't paying respect. He mollified the crowd by explaining that he too was sad, but that his long years of service spoke louder than the display of a flag. Franklin Pierce died in 1869 at age 64. Does Franklin Pierce deserve his ranking as one of our worst presidents?
I'm not trying to dodge this one. I don't think Pierce comes down as one of our best presidents in any way. But he wasn't a terrible, awful person.
James Buchanan was in this house when he was notified he won the election to the presidency.
Betty Nauman has been giving tours of Wheatland, the Lancaster, Pennsylvania estate of President James Buchanan, for close to 30 years.
The portrait of James Buchanan was done early in his campaign.
It's a gorgeous home, with one very special amenity.
It has 2 adult seats, probably a seat for a teenager down there. And
that Wheatland's director, Patrick Clark, showed us. Oh my God, an outhouse for 5. You could have a whole cabinet meeting in here.
The family that goes together.
But it's in the proverbial toilet where historians rank our 15th president.
Oh, he's definitely the worst.
The worst ever?
the worst president ever.
Robert Strauss wrote a book about Buchanan.
Ah, here's Buchanan.
He's also got a cigar box filled with presidential action figures.
Here's Jackson. You remember when they talked to each other?
Oh, but Jackson hated Buchanan, right?
Jackson hated Buchanan.
Of course, not everyone hated Buchanan. After all, he was elected president in 1856. But this Northern Democrats' sympathies with the slave-holding South exacerbated long-simmering tensions, setting the stage for the Civil War. Yet at Wheatland, they're not quite so hard on the guy. Where would you put James Buchanan in the ranking of the 43 men who have occupied the Oval Office?
Probably 42nd.
He had opportunity to write a book. Don't they all write a book?
If Buchanan is remembered at all, it's for being the bachelor president, the only one never to marry. Let's just get this out of the way right now.
Okay.
What was the deal with James Buchanan?
He did have a bad relationship early on. His fiancée probably committed suicide.
Because he was gay?
Well, maybe so.
There's no evidence to say that he was gay, but there's no evidence to prove that he was a heterosexual either.
But there's plenty of evidence that he knew how to throw a great party.
He threw the best party of the middle part of the 19th century, the inaugural ball. 6,000 people show up.
And Buchanan seemed worth celebrating. Buchanan had quite a resume.
The greatest of anybody who's ever run for president. He served in both houses of the Pennsylvania State Legislature, served in both houses of the U.S. Congress. He was an ambassador to Russia, ambassador to Great Britain. He was also Secretary of State.
There were high hopes at the beginning of his administration?
I think so, but they were dashed pretty quickly.
Only 2 days after his inauguration, the Supreme Court handed down the infamous Dred Scott decision, allowing that escaped slaves be forcibly returned to their owners. Buchanan backed that decision. Slavery would be the country's and his undoing.
He feared that if you handled the issue of slavery too robustly, that it would create what he believed would be the end of the Union, secession.
And that's exactly what happened. After Lincoln's election, but before his inauguration, 7 states seceded, while a politically paralyzed Buchanan presided. When all these states start seceding, when the country is falling apart, what is his reaction?
His biggest reaction is his friends are leaving him because many of his cabinet are Southerners, many of his friends are Southerners.
So his biggest reaction is a personal one, like, guys, I thought we were all friends.
Yeah, I thought we were all friends.
The ensuing Civil War would become known as Buchanan's War. What does Buchanan get right?
Well, what he gets right is not much, to tell you the truth.
Upon leaving Washington, it is said that Buchanan told incoming President Abraham Lincoln, "Sir, if you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel in returning to Wheatland, you are a happy man indeed."
He said to friends and family alike, I could well be the last president of these United States. Now, if you'll follow me...
Still, at 91, Betty Nauman doesn't plan on abandoning Buchanan or his home anytime soon.
I think this house keeps me young.
Well, James Buchanan did something right. No survey of forgotten presidents would be complete without our 17th president, Andrew Johnson. Do some people come in thinking it's Andrew Jackson?
Oh, lots of times, absolutely.
Andrew Johnson's presidency would end in disgrace. But in 1864, when Republican President Abraham Lincoln was running for re-election during the Civil War and needed a running mate who'd balance the ticket, Tennessee's Andrew Johnson was his pick.
He was something politically that really wasn't even supposed to exist. He was a Union-supporting Southern Democrat. It's kind of like Sasquatch. You know, I've heard you exist, but I've never seen one.
I am loving that banner, Lincoln Sasquatch 64. Burke Greer is a ranger at the Andrew Johnson National Historic Site in Greenville, Tennessee.
Lots of things with his name on it here.
Where you'll find the Andrew Johnson Bank, the Andrew Johnson Highway, the Andrew Johnson Inn,
He is always, for this town, going to be the local boy does good story.
Is this town still proud of him?
Absolutely.
Johnson was a tailor here before he ran for office.
So they would constantly need to keep heating different irons.
And his shop, the original still stands, became a place for everyday people to talk politics.
His people were the yeomen, the good, solid, working people of Eastern Tennessee. He stood for public schools. He stood for public libraries. He liked state fairs. Anything to give the working man a leg up.
Johnson's backstory, says historian Howard Means, was every bit as raw as the rail splitters. If Lincoln and Johnson were competing in the humble Olympics, who would come away with the gold?
I think Johnson would have. His father died when he was 3 years old. It was a penniless family. He had basically no education. His wife taught him to write when he was in his early 20s.
Which made his political ascent all the more stunning. From town alderman all the way up to vice president, he didn't lose a single election. But on the very day Lincoln delivered his iconic second inaugural address, Johnson had a little too much whiskey.
He rambles really drunkenly for about 7-8 minutes. He's reeling around some. He's filled with rage, basically, criticizing the ambassadors who were there as, as highborn and all that sort of stuff.
Still, there were high hopes for Johnson after the shock of Lincoln's assassination just 5 weeks later on Good Friday.
When you look at sermons that were preached that Easter Sunday, many northern churches talked about the nation being delivered at the right moment to the man who could do the job.
The stage was set for this guy to be a savior.
Yeah, precisely.
But the task ahead of Johnson may have been the most daunting any president has ever faced.
It's impossible to conceive of the America of 1865 when Johnson took office. I mean, you're trying to heal the wounds of a 4-year war with 600,000 people dead. There are 4 million freed slaves in the South, in a country of 30 million people.
Johnson wanted the post-war South treated leniently. As for the fate of freed slaves, he wanted that left up to the states. But many of his so-called radical Republican opponents wanted to punish the secessionists and to guarantee civil and voting rights to freedmen. The clash led to crisis, with the president all but declaring war on Congress. In his Washington birthday speech in 1866, he declaimed, "They may slander me, but let me say I do not intend to be bullied by my enemies." Did he take things personally?
Yes, he was very thin-skinned. He took just about everything personally. He remembered taunts and jeers from decades gone by. He never forgot the sound of somebody criticizing him.
The more you would try to get him to open up and listen to a different side of thinking, the further back he would go, almost to being like petulant, if you will, almost like a child. He would just ball up and not really want to hear anything you have to say.
Despite the personal pleas of abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass, Johnson vetoed major bills that would have helped former slaves. Congress overrode him. Finally, the bad blood spilled over. The president was impeached and escaped removal from office by just 1 vote.
On the wall here is the impeachment tickets. If you went to the impeachment trial, you bought a ticket for every day.
At the Greene County History Museum, Betty Fletcher is the keeper of all things Andrew Johnson, including tickets to his 1868 impeachment trial.
I think it's valuable, very valuable, the complete set.
Well, those are pretty great, unless you're the guy being impeached. He's not a success as president. How do you explain that to people?
I don't know who would have been a success right then, right there. Lincoln may have had a little easier row to hoe just because of his political savvy, but I certainly don't think it would have been smooth sailing even for Lincoln.
His mind is so complex.
At the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, Abraham Lincoln is prominently placed, casting a shadow on his much less popular successor. How do you think he'd feel about being stuck in the corner? Lincoln's where all the traffic is.
He wouldn't like it. I don't think he'd like it. Even Buchanan gets a better spot over there.
Now that's an insult.
Yeah, that's an insult, I would say.
The things that people think they know about Ulysses S. Grant.
Well, when I was growing up, the 3 things that would be constantly sort of laid out as truth to my face were that he was a bad student at West Point, therefore stupid, and that he was a drunk, and that he was a bad president, therefore stupid again. And this was always presented to me as fact, as if it wouldn't hurt my feelings to say it to my face.
One thing that Grant did right as president was to hold the Union together. It required maintaining the ideals of Lincoln, the ideals of equality, the ideals of inclusion of African Americans, but it also required allowing the South to re-enter the Union on the basis of the other states. It was Grant who scattered the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1870s, at a time when the Klan was engaged in what amounted to irregular warfare in the South against African Americans and Republicans. He succeeded momentarily. In fact, the Klan did not revive until the 1920s. After Grant left office, the South reverted to a system in which whites ruled and blacks suffered.
Is it fair to say that on the battlefield he saved the Union, and in the Oval Office he helped preserve it?
Yeah. In fact, I would say that Grant saved the Union twice. First on the battlefield during the Civil War, and secondly as president, at a time when the gains of the Civil War were at risk.
When I spoke here on his birthday on April 27th, as I do every year, it was the time when there was a move in Congress to replace U.S. Grant with Ronald Reagan on the $50 bill. And I took great pains not to object to Ronald Reagan particularly, but I said, but there's no president who's ever done for this country what U.S. Grant did. And like him or not, you cannot take away what he did.
"1876 was a banner year for America, the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. A nationwide celebration with a full fifth of the country's population descending on Philadelphia for the Centennial Exposition. But beneath the revelry, there was a deep sense of unease.
This was the depths of a pretty serious economic depression. There was widespread unemployment. There were fairly violent labor disputes going on in various parts of the country.
And, says Columbia University history professor Eric Foner, the country was still feeling the aftershocks of the Civil War, which had ended only 11 years before.
There was still violence in the South, which had existed since the Civil War because of white supremacists' opposition to the giving of citizenship rights to the former slaves. So it was not a tranquil year, that's for sure.
1876 was also a presidential election year, and all of these issues, plus the rampant corruption in the administration of outgoing President Ulysses S. Grant, would factor into the contest.
It was a man who is faithful and true. His is the man.
The Republicans ran Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes. Was he charismatic?
I wouldn't say so.
This is a spectacular porch.
Yeah, Hayes joked that he wanted a porch with a house attached.
Dustin McLaughlin is the historian at the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center in Fremont, Ohio.
He really exemplified that American tradition of the office seeks you, you don't seek it.
We have kind of the trifecta over here. We have General Grant, General Sherman, General Sheridan.
All great Union generals.
Yes, and all from Ohio as well.
Hayes's service as a general during the Civil War, says the center's executive director, Christy Weininger, was central to his identity.
He saw firsthand the passions that were behind the sectionalism that caused the Civil War. So I think that was always in the back of his mind, is how do we make this country feel united again?
Meanwhile, the Democrats were hungry to reclaim the White House, which they hadn't won in 20 years. Their candidate, New York Governor Samuel Tilden, a bachelor lawyer, had made his name fighting big city corruption.
Tilden and Hendricks, with Tilden and Hendricks, hurrah for Tilden and Hendricks.
The man was a bit lethargic, and quite frankly, a lot of people thought he was dull. Dull but dedicated.
His home sat across from New York City's Gramercy Park, and is today the National Arts Club, overseen by Robert Yonner.
I have to tell you, this house is kind of nicer than the White House.
This house is a great Tilden legacy.
While both had beautiful homes, neither candidate, says Eric Foner, was exactly Mount Rushmore material.
There's another way of putting it. Both of them were basically mediocrities, politically.
Still, the turnout that November 7th remains the highest ever for a presidential election.
The turnout was 82% of eligible voters. That's extraordinary.
You had two political parties competing throughout the nation with people very loyal to them.
On election night, Tilden was ahead in the popular vote by 260,000 votes.
Hayes actually goes to bed believing Tilden had won, and he actually has interviews with reporters saying, I have lost. The Republican Party has to step in and tell him to stop saying that.
That's because Republican officials still saw a narrow path to victory for Hayes.
If Hayes could carry the three southern states where the results were not yet clear, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, he would win by one electoral vote. And they just issued a statement. Hayes has carried those states and is elected. And in a certain sense, it's almost like the 2000 election where Bush made an early claim of victory, even though it was so divided, and Gore never quite contested it properly.
And just as in the year 2000, America in 1876 woke up the morning after the election not knowing who had won. Inauguration back then was in early March, which meant the country had 4 months to figure out who would be its 19th president.
This election was flawed from top to bottom.
Massive voter fraud, says Foner, only added to the confusion.
There was violence throughout the South against African American voters to try to make it impossible for them to vote.
Black men, almost all of whom were Republican back then, had only recently won the right to vote, and Southern Democrats were actively suppressing that vote.
If there had been a fair election in the South, there's no question Hayes would have won by a large margin.
But as the weeks dragged on, neither side was willing to concede.
How tense did it get?
There were Democratic newspapers with headlines, "March to Washington to install Tilden as president." There were Republicans saying, we're on the verge of another civil war.
Tilden or blood. This idea that if Tilden's not counted in, we might have another war, to fight here.
Was there a fear that there could be dueling presidencies?
Yes. There were key Democrats who asked Tilden to take the oath of office anyway. He refused to do so.
And there were a lot of people who said, particularly businessmen and others, who said, we don't even care who's elected, but get this settled.
But Congress was divided, and the Constitution offered no clear direction for resolving the impasse. So in January of 1877, a 15-member electoral commission was formed. The 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats would determine which candidate won the states in dispute.
By some coincidence, all the electoral votes are allocated to Hayes by a vote of 8-7 in each case.
That's right. The commission voted along party lines.
But it's not over yet.
It's not over yet.
The Tilden camp cried foul. With inauguration just days away and the nation on edge, representatives for both candidates met in Washington for secret negotiations.
Ironically, they took place at Wormley House, a major hotel, which is owned by a black man, Wormley, probably the most well-to-do African-American in the city of Washington at that time.
Ironic, because the agreement forged there, known as the Compromise of 1877, would have long-lasting repercussions for black Americans in the South.
The Democrats will not stop the inauguration of Hayes. They will accept Hayes as president. Hayes will end the remaining Reconstruction.
In other words, the Republicans get the White House. The Democrats effectively regain control of the American South. No more federal protection of the rights of recently freed African Americans.
The Democrats promise they will respect the basic rights of the former slaves, which they do not do.
Rutherford B. Hayes was certified as president on March 2, 1877. Samuel Tilden accepted the decision. 3 days later, Hayes was inaugurated in a peaceful transfer of power.
I think if either Hayes or Tilden had been of the personality that was very aggressive, that was very intense, really wanted this presidency for very selfish reasons, I think the whole tenor would have changed.
Today, says Christy Weininger, President Hayes is remembered less for what he did during his single term in office than for the election that threatened, once again, to tear apart the country.
Are visitors bringing up the election of 1876 more?
They're very interested in how divisive the country was then. And somehow knowing that we've been there before and survived, I think gives some comfort and some hope to people.
Of the 4 U.S. presidents who have been assassinated, 2, Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, are engraved in our collective memory. William McKinley had already been president a full term when he was murdered at the turn of the 20th century. But James A. Garfield, in office less than 4 months when he was shot in 1881, is for most Americans an historical footnote. And that, says author Candace Millard, is a great shame.
He was, without question, one of the most extraordinary men ever elected president. He was absolutely brilliant. You know, he was born into incredible poverty.
In a log cabin.
In a log cabin, the last of the log cabin presidents. His father died before he was 2 years old, and so to put himself through college, his first year, he was a janitor and a carpenter. By his second year, they made him assistant professor of literature and ancient languages. By the time he was 26, he was this college's president. It was just one of these astonishing things. He just had an off-the-charts mind.
His loss is all the more heartbreaking, Millard writes in her recent book, because Garfield didn't need to die, even after he was shot. A Civil War hero and 9-term congressman, Garfield was drafted by fellow Republicans to run for president, an office he never sought.
He called the presidency a bleak mountain. He knew that it was going to be a very difficult and lonely position to be in. And, you know, this is the height of the spoils system.
The spoils system, under which anyone could petition the president in person for a government job, regardless of experience or ability.
And so could anyone just show up at the White House?
They could. I mean, he would have like 100 office seekers every day.
Charles Guiteau was one of those office seekers. Delusional and grandiose, he drifted through life.
This is a man who had failed at everything he had tried, and he had tried everything. You know, he had tried law, he had tried evangelism, he'd even tried a free love commune in the 1800s, and he had failed there too. You know, the women there had nicknamed him Charles Get Out.
Guiteau thought he should be named Minister to France. Day after day, he visited the White House, even meeting Garfield once. But when his demand wasn't met,
he had what he believed was a divine inspiration, a message from God that he needed to kill the president. And you know, this is 16 years after Lincoln's assassination, but there's still no Secret Service protection.
On July 2nd, 1881, the president was scheduled to travel by train from D.C. to Massachusetts.
And so Guiteau woke up early that morning, and he went to the train station, and he had his shoes shined, and he was ready with his gun and his papers.
Shoes shined?
Yeah, because he was very aware of the attention he would be receiving.
The president, along with 2 of his sons, arrived at the station.
So they walk in, Garfield takes just a few steps, Guiteau steps out of the shadows and shoots him twice, once in the arm and once in the back.
But the gunshot is not fatal.
It's not. It doesn't hit his spinal cord. It doesn't hit any vital organs.
Within minutes, doctors converged on the fallen president, using their fingers to poke and prod his open wounds.
12 different doctors inserted unsterilized fingers and instruments in Garfield's back, probing for this bullet. And the first examination took place on the train station floor. I mean, you can't imagine a more germ-infested environment.
American doctors at the time didn't believe germs existed at all. And according to Dr. Jeffrey Resnick of the National Library of Medicine, they rejected the use of antiseptics pioneered by Joseph Lister, for whom Listerine would later be named.
Lister, an Englishman, embraced this theory in the early 1860s based upon the fact that it's germs that cause disease. American doctors did not believe in the Listerian theory because they subscribed to the miasma theory. Bad air caused disease and illness, not germs. Germs you couldn't see.
On the scene at the train station, cabinet member Robert Todd Lincoln. Present at his father's death 16 years before, he would also witness the murder of McKinley 20 years later.
Of the 4 presidential assassinations, he was there for 3 of them.
A pretty ghoulish distinction.
That's right. It's unfortunate.
It was Lincoln who summoned Dr. D. Willard Bliss. The D stood for doctor, his actual first name.
And Bliss was a uniquely arrogant and ambitious man, and he just took charge.
There would be no second opinions. For an excruciating 80 days, made even worse by the sweltering Washington summer, Garfield suffered stoically as his condition worsened.
He is riddled with infection at this point. He has these abscesses all through his body.
And he was starving to death. Unable to keep down the sumptuous meals he was being fed, the president's weight plunged from 210 pounds to 130. In a panic to find the bullet still lodged in Garfield, Bliss called on Alexander Graham Bell. Yes, that Bell, the inventor of the telephone. Bell's task? Use the metal detector he'd invented to find the bullet so it could once and for all be extracted. But unbeknownst to Bell, Garfield was lying on a bed made of metal springs, rare at the time.
Which is obviously going to affect a metal detector. But worse than that, Bliss believed and had publicly stated that the bullet was on the right side of the president's body, and he would only let Bell examine that part of the president's body. And of course, the bullet had gone to the left.
Once again, just willful ignorance?
You know, it's just one of the incredible dangers of ambition, you know, and he did not want to be proven wrong.
President Garfield finally died on September 19, 1881. The autopsy confirmed Bliss's ignorance.
President Garfield didn't have to die. President Garfield died because of what his doctors did and what they didn't do.
But from this senseless horror came good. The use of antiseptics was quickly accepted by American doctors. Civil service reform was enacted. And perhaps even more significantly,
one of the most important things that happened is it really brought the country together for the first time since the Civil War.
It connected the North and the South?
It did. It did. It healed this deep, deep, deep wound because there was this common sorrow and this understanding of loss.
As for the man who shot the president, Charles Guiteau would be hanged, only aware at the very end that he would not be celebrated for killing the president. There's a quote in your book from Guiteau where he says something like, "It's the doctors that murdered Garfield."
That's right. He says, you know, yes, I shot him, but his doctors killed him.
This insane person actually says something sane.
That's right. And it's true. Unfortunately, it's absolutely true.
The rumors persist. Was the president actually born in the U.S.? And if he wasn't, what does that say about President Chester Alan Arthur? Who did you think I was talking about? Our 21st president, Chester Alan Arthur, is remembered as much for his outlandish facial hair as he is for his outlandish facial hair.
It's really awful. I would have been cutting those off in his sleep.
Yeah, no, it's a little much. But when Arthur became president in 1881, the whispers surrounding him were about more than his whiskers. Democrats claimed that Arthur, a Republican, wasn't born in Vermont, as he maintained, but in Canada, which according to the Constitution made him ineligible for the Oval Office. The charge was never proven, but even today there are those who say it's true.
So this is the birthplace of Chester A. Arthur, 1829.
Heather Darch says that Arthur was born in this modest house in the town of Bedford, in French-speaking Canada, just 15 miles north of the U.S. border. It's not often that a presidential birthplace comes up for sale.
I know. I think Americans could come up here and own a piece of Americana very easily.
And you are fairly convinced that he was born here.
Yeah, I am actually. I really do believe that Chester A. Arthur was America's first Canadian president.
Okay, this is basically the research room.
Just down the road in the village of Stanbridge East, Darch and Judy Antle oversee the region's archives. If we're investigating the question of where Chester Arthur was actually born, this is a good place to come?
This would be the place to come, yes.
This much we know. Chester's father, William Arthur, was an itinerant minister and teacher who traveled back and forth across the very porous border. And when his son, the future president, was born, this was a schoolhouse.
Right.
Where Chester Alan Arthur's father was teaching in 1829?
Right, exactly.
The year that he was born?
Right.
Right here in Canada?
Exactly. Our records indicate that this house has always been known as the White House.
Ironic.
Yeah, very.
What's more, the family of Chester's mother, Malvina, was living nearby, in Canada, at the time of his birth.
Malvina, we know, already had children, so she would have needed someone to look after the children while she was nursing a new baby. So very likely that she went to her mother for help and assistance. So yes, it's very likely that Chester was born here.
And then there's this. Chester Alan Arthur lied about the year of his birth till the day he died. And he refused to answer questions raised by the birthers of his time.
If he was born in the States, why was it such a big cover-up? Why didn't things just come out into the open? Why is it still an issue right now, and why is it still a mystery?
Not surprisingly, 30 miles south in Fairfield, Vermont, the locals at Chester's Bakery stand by their namesake as made in America. Now, the people over in Quebec that we've spoken to, the Canadians say that they know that he was born over there.
Fairfield people know that he was born here. We have a pamphlet right in the window said, born in Fairfield.
Well, they've got pamphlets in Canada.
They must have lied.
Granted, the pamphlets are in French, so I couldn't...
So you couldn't read it, right? Ours are in English, and it says, born here in Fairfield.
We travel down Chester Arthur Road to the Chester Arthur Historic Site, which used to be called the Birthplace, to investigate. Do you think there's at least a chance that he was born in Canada?
No. Well, yes, there is a chance, but I doubt it.
John Dumville is in charge of Vermont's historic sites. Is it possible that Chester Alan Arthur was born in Kenya?
No. Come on.
Fairfield's town clerk, Amanda Forbes, showed us this record indicating that Chester's father, William, was elected to a local school board months before his son's birth in 1829. This is sort of as good as it gets in terms of evidence.
Right, we don't have any concrete birth certificate. I wish we did, but we don't.
The truth may be lost to time and to the fact that Chester Alan Arthur burned all of his papers right before he died. What would the average Canadian say if he or she found out that Chester Arthur was actually Canadian?
I think they would first have to tell them who he was.
They probably don't have any idea.
And then they might be pretty thrilled.
I think they'd be pleased.
For 25-year-old New York State Assemblyman Theodore Roosevelt, February 1884 began joyously.
He was the happiest man on the planet. His wife had just given birth to a baby girl.
But then came some distressing news.
He gets a telegram saying, "Come back immediately. Your wife is dying and your mother is dying."
The future president rushed from Albany home to Manhattan to find the two most important women in his life suddenly fallen ill. His mother Martha with typhoid fever, his young bride Alice with Bright's disease, a failure of the kidneys.
His younger brother Elliot ran out of the house and said, "There is a plague on this house." He got there just in time for his wife to die in his arms, and his mother died shortly later. It was just awful.
His diary entry that grim Valentine's Day, a stark X and 8 simple words. Roosevelt needed to get far, far away.
And he knew he had to do something to restore his soul.
Ted Roosevelt IV is President Theodore Roosevelt's great-grandson.
It just devastated him. And he had enough sense. He knew that he had to throw himself into work. He had to be in the outdoors.
And so he headed west to the wildest, loneliest place he knew, the Badlands of the Dakota Territory, in what is now North Dakota.
He described it as a bizarrely shaped country with a haunting, melancholy beauty. Everything, the hills, the kinds of trees, the grass here, this is exactly what he saw.
For 3 years, he lived here, along the Little Missouri River, in the shade of the cottonwood trees.
There's no sound that is more soothing than the wind going through the cottonwood leaves. It makes a lovely rustle. It's just beautiful.
But the trees, they kind of glitter.
Yeah, they have that wonderful glitter.
These are the same trees T.R. saw from the front porch of his Elkhorn ranch, and the same kind of birds he heard.
Hear the dove in the background? Coo, coo. T.R. wrote about the dove. There can be no more mournful sound of unending grief than the sound of a mourning dove.
We're walking up to what would be the entrance?
Yeah, this is the entrance.
The ranch house the old lion built with his own hands is gone now. Only the foundation stones remain.
So this is original.
So that's original, absolutely.
And I have to say that as a history buff, I kind of geek out on something like this. I mean, it's just...
Oh, it's kind of cool.
To think that Theodore Roosevelt laid this in 1884.
Yes.
2 guides he'd befriended in the woods of Maine came west to help.
He was good with an axe, but he overheard the 2 guides talking amongst themselves, and they said something to the effect, well, we chopped each down 35 trees, and the boss, he beavered down 17.
It's still impressive. The formerly asthmatic child is beavering down 17 trees.
Yeah. And that's that's no mean accomplishment.
Yes, Roosevelt was a sickly child who by nonstop activity bulldozed through obstacles, the embodiment of the strenuous life.
Talking about Theodore Roosevelt's energy, please don't take this the wrong way, but was there some sort of chemical imbalance? I mean, just his ability to do so much.
That's a great question. He wrote, I think poignantly, if a man rides hard and fast enough, he can leave black hair behind him. He knew that he had to really engage himself all the time because he might get depressed.
He became a cattleman, albeit a Harvard-educated aristocratic one.
The people out west, and this was really out west then, must have thought that he was from a totally different world.
Yeah, a totally different world. He wore glasses, which was unusual. He dressed in a fancy way. He used language in a way that was totally different than theirs. But the experience was one which rubbed off this sort of thin, brittle veneer of the Eastern dude, and he became a regular guy.
And this wild, beautiful land shaped the way Roosevelt viewed the environment. That's why it's known as the cradle of conservation.
It's where he learned, and he saw firsthand the need to save the land.
But today, this view, virtually unchanged for more than 100 years, is indeed beginning to change as North Dakota's oil boom encircles the Elkhorn Ranch with pump jacks, gas flares, and roadways.
There is a rig there on the ridgeline that would not have been here in Theodore Roosevelt's day. It's one of 7 wells that are within the historic district.
Stephanie Meeks is executive director of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which has placed the Elkhorn Ranch on its most endangered places list.
It's a visual intrusion in a place that was one of solitude. So we'd like to protect anything that Teddy Roosevelt could have seen from the front porch of his cabin.
It's not just the sights that are threatened, but also the sounds that soothed TR's wounded soul.
That's what we want to preserve. It's the solitude, the scenic beauty of this, and the sound.
The man who would go on to create 5 national parks and protect 230 million acres of land once said, "I never would have been president if it had not been for my experiences in North Dakota."
He wanted to protect great landscapes for the American people for all time, and it's our turn now to protect this landscape so that it can influence and inspire people for generations, just as it did Teddy Roosevelt.
Do your kids or your husband ever say to you, "Doris, you've got to stop living in the past"?
Every now and then. I remember when I was writing Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and my kids said they would come by the room, and I was yelling at Franklin, "Would you please be nicer to Eleanor?" Or saying to Eleanor, "Forget about the fact that he had an affair 20 years ago." And they're thinking, what is going on in that room? She's talking to dead presidents.
And dead presidents have been very good to Doris Kearns Goodwin. All of her presidential biographies have been bestsellers. She won a Pulitzer for her book on FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt. And her Lincoln biography was the basis of the Steven Spielberg movie.
I can't accomplish a goddamn thing of any human meaning or worth until we cure ourselves of slavery and end this pestilential war.
Her newest book is about the friendship between Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. Unusual for Goodwin in that one of them is not a larger-than-life president, although he certainly was large.
How many people are going to know much about Taft other than that he weighed 350 pounds?
And had a bathtub that could fit 4 men.
And
right?
Indeed, there's a picture of the bathtub with the 4 guys in there.
That is a White House scandal waiting to happen. The 2 men were a study in contrasts. Roosevelt, a contemporary, wrote, "barreled through life as if launched by a catapult."
I've never written about anybody who has more energy, accomplished more. Taft is the great procrastinator. He waited till the last minute for everything, and it got him in trouble over and over again. So I keep saying to myself, when I'm about to put something off, I don't want to be Taft in this, I want to be Teddy.
Be Teddy, not Taft. Be Teddy, not Taft. Right. Just hearing about him is just chipping away at my self-esteem. I mean, he does more in a page than I get done in a year.
One of my friends thought he drank 40 cups of coffee a day. I haven't quite confirmed that. But he did give the slogan to Maxwell House, "Good to the very last drop."
To push through his progressive agenda, Teddy Roosevelt forged a winning partnership with like-minded reporters, whom he dubbed muckrakers.
They were at the White House. They had lunch. They had dinner with him. They had breakfast with him.
To keep them close by, he even gave them their own White House press room.
Lyndon Johnson used to say, "It's better to have your enemies inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in."
LBJ would be the first of Goodwin's guys, as she calls her presidential subjects.
The whole relationship began because I was a 24-year-old White House intern.
You met him at a dance,
Yes,
right?
I did. I mean, it used to be a badge of honor to say you were a 24-year-old White House intern. It's gotten a little more complicated.
Johnson asked her to dance, then told her he wanted her to work directly for him. But there was something he didn't know.
I'd been a graduate student at Harvard, and I wrote an anti-war, anti-LBJ piece that came out in the New Republic several days after the dance.
Ouch.
So I was sure he'd kick me out of the program, but instead, surprisingly, he said, "Oh, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can."
Well, what do you think he saw in you?
He saw a young girl, I think, to be honest. I mean, he was somewhat of a womanizer, but he also saw someone who loved history. He saw someone who liked to listen to him. He loved to talk.
And Goodwin would do a lot of listening when she moved to LBJ's ranch to help him write his memoirs after he left office.
He couldn't sleep, and so he'd come into my room, and I would know that he was coming in, so I would get up even earlier. And then he'd come into the bed,
At around 5 a.m.
5 a.m. He'd pull the sheets up, and mornings were hard for him because he was thinking about all that he had lost. And I would sit in a chair, and he'd just talk to me.
You're sitting in a chair in your room, and a former president of the United States is in your bed with the covers up to his neck, just
telling
kind
me
of
stories.
soliloquizing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
I mean, it seemed natural then. Now I look at it, oh my God, what was going on?
She says she never worried about things going too far, except once.
One day he invited me to go on a picnic by the river, and red check tablecloth and wine and romantic trappings, and I think, oh my God, what's going to happen? And he says, Doris, more than any other woman I've ever known, and my heart sank. And then he said, you remind me of my mother. It was so embarrassing given what was going on. And she was this big, buxom woman, there's no way, except that she was an intellectual. She loved reading, and she would have been, he thought, a great writer.
What Goodwin saw and heard was a man who, outside the Oval Office, felt like the shell of a man.
I think I saw in LBJ a man for whom, even though his family loved him, there was such a hole in his heart that needed to be filled by the love of millions of people, by the crowd. There were no sports in his life, no recreation. Work was the center.
LBJ's was the model of a life Goodwin didn't want to lead. She married White House speechwriter Richard Goodwin and raised a family.
We have 3 boys, and I realized I couldn't do it all, so I gave up teaching, and I just became a writer. I'm still going to Red Sox games an unimaginable number of days. We have season tickets.
She lives in historic Concord, Massachusetts.
Do you look at buildings and trees and think, this was here when Lincoln was president?
Yeah, I'm as crazy as you. I do think that.
Most of the rooms in her house, it seems, are libraries.
This is the corridor of presidential biographies.
This is the Goodwin Presidential Library.
This is the Goodwin Presidential Library.
Even the most successful presidents face controversy. So too this presidential historian. In 2002, it was revealed that Goodwin had used passages from other books in her 1987 book on the Kennedys without full attribution. Goodwin blamed her mistakes on sloppy note-taking.
What was that whole experience like? Was that an ordeal?
Of course. Of course, because I care so much about my fellow writers, it is nothing that I ever intentionally would have done, so it felt bad. And the best thing you can do is to learn from your mistakes and just make sure that you know how to do it right, and I have.
At the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace in New York City, Goodwin remembered how her love of history got started.
If you come here as a kid, you know, as I did at Sagamore Hill, or I went to Roosevelt's Hyde Park thing, you can imagine these people living, walking, getting up in bed, getting up in the morning, and
her mission now, to make dead presidents come as alive for her readers as they are for her.
If you had to be one of these guys, which would you be?
Probably, no question, Teddy Roosevelt. I would venture to project that he was the happiest president we've had. He loved what he was doing. He loved his family. He loved getting up in the morning. He had that energy.
He knew how to work, love, and play.
He knew that.
As for the Teddy-Taft friendship, it broke apart when Roosevelt decided to run against Taft in 1912 under a third party. The two split the Republican vote. Democrat Woodrow Wilson swept into power.
Teddy and Bill are running in last place.
Recently, baseball fanatic Goodwin had the chance to broker a truce.
I suppose part of my dream is that I could bring them back together somehow. So it was amazing. I went to the Washington National Stadium.
Who's it gonna be?
And they have these 2 mascots, Taft and Teddy. So I was able to stand and get them to go together. So my dream was realized. I look like an absolute midget. They are so huge. I look even shorter than I actually am, but it was such a great day.
The Doris Kearns Goodwin peace accord.
Exactly.
When you hear the name Woodrow Wilson, you might think aloof, intellectual, the professor turned president with the pince-nez for glasses. And yes, that's how it's pronounced.
He was the college professor with the pince-nez, so he's easy to bash.
And that's a French word.
And that's a French word, Goodwin.
But in his new biography of the 28th president, A. Scott Berg wants you to know that Wilson was no cold fish.
Woodrow Wilson was an extremely emotional, romantic man. I don't think there's been a more emotionally turbulent presidency than Wilson's.
Mrs. Wilson was giving birth in this room, in that very bed, as a matter of fact.
Born in Stanton, Virginia, the son of a Presbyterian minister, Wilson, from a very early age, imbued everything he did with moral purpose.
It's quite amazing. I mean, here's Woodrow Wilson at 9 years old drafting a constitution for his Little League baseball team. I mean, it's got to be the only Little League team to this day with its own constitution.
For college, he ventured north to New Jersey, to what would become Princeton University.
Is it true that when he got to Princeton as an undergraduate, he had never heard the Star-Spangled Banner?
That's true. He had never heard it. He was a Southern boy.
He would return to Princeton as its president, transforming what had become something of a country club into a first-rate university. The political bosses of New Jersey took notice, and made him an offer he couldn't refuse.
To run for governor of New Jersey, which at the time is perhaps the most corrupt state in the Union.
I think you can take the perhaps out of. In 1910, the very corrupt Democratic machine of very corrupt New Jersey says, who is the squeaky cleanest man in all of New Jersey we could run as our puppet?
But Wilson would be nobody's puppet.
He does get elected, and the first thing he does is kick out the machine. And now everybody in the country is saying, who is this?
Within 2 years, he was elected to the White House. Turned out our only president with a PhD knew how to connect with the masses.
He never spoke down. He always raised the audience to his level. This had a magical effect, especially on the uneducated, because they felt better about themselves for having heard him and understood him.
We want to establish a real partnership between all the people and the federal government.
Wilson didn't just go to the people. He went to Capitol Hill, becoming the first president in 110 years to address Congress in person. He would do so 25 times in his first term alone. His progressive agenda sailed through. The establishment of the Federal Reserve, the 8-hour workday, workman's comp. But on one issue, he was decidedly unprogressive.
Under his watch, the District of Columbia and the federal government were segregated racially. It was a big backward step.
Woodrow Wilson didn't invent segregation, but he certainly institutionalized it in the government offices in Washington, D.C., which in effect sanctioned segregation throughout the country.
By 1914, the world was at war. The U.S. remained neutral at first. Meanwhile, Wilson's own world was crumbling. His wife Ellen lay dying.
There's a moment where he's literally writing a letter to the heads of state in Europe saying, must you really proceed with war? He's writing that with one hand and holding his dying wife's hand with the other.
But only months after her death, Wilson would fall madly in love with Edith Bowling.
She was the first woman with a driver's license in the District of Columbia.
She had wheels.
She had wheels, yeah.
Wilson lobbied hard for her.
Who has time to write 3 love letters a day while the world is falling apart?
Well, Woodrow Wilson made the time, he would tell you, and that this was more important because he couldn't serve as president unless he had the woman he loved, basically.
Wilson wooed her during long drives. This was his 1919 Pierce Arrow.
This was his car. It was part of the White House fleet.
It's really nice. It's very comfortable.
It is.
Edith became the second Mrs. Wilson.
And she was very buxom.
She was buxom, yes, yes. And don't think Sigmund Freud didn't make a lot of that when he wrote about Wilson and his marriage.
Is that right?
He did.
That he needed kind of like a mothering thing?
Absolutely.
Wilson was reelected as the man who kept us out of war. But within weeks of his second inauguration, he would declare, the world must be made safe for democracy.
And it's an about-face.
It is an about-face, and it is the underpinnings of our foreign policy to this day.
America sent 2 million doughboys to Europe and defeated the Germans. In Paris, Wilson was welcomed as the savior of the world.
It was bigger than anything Napoleon saw, Caesar saw. Now, does all that adulation somehow affect you? I think he still remained the preacher's son with a Christ complex.
Wilson would spend 6 months in Paris. His mission? To establish a League of Nations to prevent all future wars.
If we had some kind of international parliament where every nation could sit, this could ostensibly stop all war.
The League is the vital and compelling part of the treaty.
The U.S. Senate balked, so in 1919, Wilson took his case to the people, a grueling 29-city tour. But outside Pueblo, Colorado, he collapsed. Days later, he suffered a stroke and took to his bed, the left side of his body paralyzed. Edith took control. How much control is still debated.
Was Edith Wilson the first female president of the United States? She would be the first to tell you she made no decisions he would not have made. That being said, nothing got to the president without passing through Edith's hands first.
But not even Edith could convince Wilson to compromise on even minor details concerning the League. The Senate would vote down Wilson's peace plan. The U.S. would not enter the League, dooming it.
Do you think it could have prevented World War II?
Yeah, I'll go on record. I think a League of Nations, Wilson's League of Nations, could have stopped World War II.
A controversial take on a controversial president whose influence is with us today.
We stand in the presence of an awakened nation. Plainly, it is a new age.
The most lasting piece of the Wilson legacy has to be that one line, the world must be made safe for democracy, for good or for bad. That really, though, has become the foundation of our foreign policy. And whenever this country even thinks of intervening in Syria or in Egypt or Iraq or wherever,
it started with Wilson.
It's really that Wilson notion that there is a moral obligation.
Lead the GOP.
In the rankings of American presidents, Warren Gamaliel Harding often comes in first, from the bottom. Even though Harding was elected in the biggest landslide up to that point, and even though he and his dog Laddie Boy remained immensely popular in office, Harding today is remembered, if at all, for his womanizing and for the scandals that engulfed his administration after he died suddenly in 1923, poisoned, some believe, by his wife.
These are the original steps here.
But in Warren Harding's hometown of Marion, Ohio, the favorite son gets more favorable treatment.
So this is Mr. and Mrs. Harding's home here.
Harding home tour guide or docent Sherry Hall sees it as her job to set the record straight.
He was not poisoned, as you might hear.
His wife didn't kill him.
His wife did not kill him. That was a totally made-up story.
In fact, says Hall, Warren and Florence Harding were very much a team during the 1920 presidential campaign, when the world beat a path to the Hardings' doorstep, literally.
It was not unusual for 10,000 people to gather before the house.
Hollywood stars came to Marion, athletes too. Al Jolson even wrote a song for the campaign and played Warren Harding's porch. 95-year-old Trella Romine had a front row seat.
When I was 4 years old, I shook hands with Harding right over the banister out here.
When you were 4 years old, you shook hands with him.
You want to shake hands with the hand that shook hands with Harding?
Wow, that is great. That's amazing.
I was scared, you know, but when I looked up at his face, it was such a kind face. So I just stuck my hand out and made history.
I'm sorry to get all tabloid with you, but do you think that Warren Harding was a womanizer?
I'm in no position to answer that question.
Okay, you're taking the fifth.
Yes.
There's little doubt that Harding was at best negligent in supervising his administration. Several of his appointees, including a cabinet member, went to jail. But students from Harding High prefer to accentuate the positive.
His presidential election was the first election that women voted in.
He was one of the presidents that helped start getting veterans health benefits.
President Harding was the only president to be elected on his birthday.
Well, this is Warren Harding's inaugural suit. He was always described as being a very natty dresser.
Here are Warren Harding's golf clubs, his briefcase, his cigars, even his shoes.
He did have the biggest feet of any president, right?
Size 12.
Size 12? I thought it was 14 and a half.
About 12 now.
Yep, just the facts, ma'am.
We'll lay it out. Then we want you, the visitor, to make your own decision.
So you're not just a docent, you're also a defense attorney.
Harding was the first president to visit Alaska. He died on the way back. Thousands lined the streets to mourn as his body made its way home to Marion, where the town built a monument for him. When President Harding died, the scandals that would define his presidency hadn't yet come to light. He was still a popular guy. Hence, the size of this monument. It's big. A bit grandiose, right? Until you consider that Warren G. Harding was a small-town boy who made it to the White House. No matter what, that's a big deal.
Warren Harding, you're the man for us.
The Constitution mandates that the president is sworn in at noon on the 20th day of January. But 9 men have assumed the nation's highest office with little or no advance warning.
From Dallas, Texas, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Lyndon Johnson took the oath aboard Air Force One after the murder of President Kennedy in Dallas. Johnson placed his hand on Kennedy's Catholic missal or prayer book, perhaps mistaking it for a Bible.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear that I will...
And Gerald Ford was sworn in after Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace.
This is the village of Plymouth Notch.
Of all these unforeseen inaugurals, the most, well, picturesque has to be Calvin Coolidge's.
This has been called one of the best preserved presidential sites in the country.
William Jenney oversees the Coolidge Historic Site in the tiny village of Plymouth Notch, Vermont, our 30th president's hometown.
This is the Coolidge homestead where Calvin lived from the time he was 4 and where he happened to be as vice president when word came that Warren Harding, the president, had died. It all happened at 2:47 in the morning.
It all looks pretty much the way it did back on that very historic, very early morning in 1923.
We're walking into the sitting room, and this is now known as the Oath of Office room.
Just like in this painting. The same table, same pen, the family Bible, the notary stamp that made it official, even that cat paperweight.
That was just a little thing that they had here in the house.
And that was that here at the time?
Possibly. It's not.
Oh, we don't
be
know
sure.
That Calvin Coolidge was really into cats or something. Is there electricity in this room?
There was no electricity in the town. This all happened by the light of this lamp here.
This actual lamp?
Right.
The house had no telephone either, so...
Someone came down here by car, knocked on the door here, and Calvin's father answered it and got the news.
And they said, your son is president.
Basically.
We'll let Calvin Coolidge himself tell you what happened next. Mr. President, what happened when your father woke you up to tell you President Harding died?
Well, Father came up the stairs calling my name.
Actually, that's a Calvin Coolidge impersonator on videotape in the visitor center.
He had been the first to address me as President of the United States, for President Harding had died.
The general store just across the street did have a telephone.
This store was once operated by Calvin's father.
As a boy, Coolidge had worked here.
He built these counters along with his dad.
They are beautiful.
Combination of bird's eye maple and cherry.
I don't know that we've had a lot of presidents who would be able to do this.
But we digress. Coolidge called down to Washington to confirm the news.
And the Attorney General advised them to go ahead and administer the oath then and there.
And so, in the sitting room of his childhood home, Calvin Coolidge was sworn in as President of the United States by the town's notary public, who just happened to be his very own father. A simple, solemn ceremony, no pomp, no circumstance, and perfectly American. Known as Silent Cal, President Calvin Coolidge was a man of few words, but many pets.
The Coolidges were known for being animal lovers.
Which is why people sent them animals as presents, says Andrew Hager, historian in residence at the Presidential Pet Museum.
Harvey Firestone, the tire magnate, gave him a pygmy hippo.
Others gave lion cubs, a black bear, even a wallaby. Yes, the Coolidge White House was really hopping. But while most of those were shipped off to the zoo, there was an unlikely exception.
One of Calvin Coolidge's supporters from Mississippi decided to send the Coolidges a Thanksgiving dinner, and what he sent them was a live raccoon.
Andrew, have you ever tried raccoon?
I have not tried raccoon.
I have. Tastes like chicken. But for the Coolidges, that idea was off the table.
They decided, well, we're going to keep her instead.
So Coolidge gave her a name, Rebecca, and then he gave her some bling. So Rebecca had jewelry.
Yeah, she had a handmade collar, actually, and it said White House Raccoon on it.
Now, the press was pretty rough on Rebecca. The Cleveland Plain Dealer called her the most obstreperous of all Coolidge's pets.
That is tough, to be called obstreperous.
Tougher still were the tabloid rumors. What do we know about Rebecca's love life?
Well, they got her a male raccoon named Reuben, but Rebecca and Reuben did not get along at all.
Rebecca Coolidge finally left the White House, along with the rest of the family, in 1929, but not without leaving her mark on presidential pet history.
When you go back and you look at the pets that presidents have had since Coolidge, there's nothing quite as unusual as a raccoon.
In late October 1929, after years of rising to dizzying heights, the stock market collapsed, ushering in one of the longest and most painful chapters in American history. Herbert Hoover had been president for less than a year.
Who decides to call it a depression?
Hoover, actually.
Kenneth White is the author of a biography of Hoover.
Before that, they always called them panics.
Right.
He liked the word depression. I don't think he anticipated that it would be one that would be stuck to him for the rest of his life.
We'd like to thank you, Herbert Hoover.
And that's no exaggeration. Consider the 1977 Broadway musical Annie, where this correspondent first heard the name Herbert Hoover. A chorus of slum dwellers mockingly thanks the president.
Did the musical Annie annoy you?
What it did is it stoked in me this burning dissent. These people don't know the whole story.
Margaret Hoover is the host of PBS's Firing Line.
Who do you think would play him in the movie?
And the great-granddaughter of the 31st president.
Leonardo DiCaprio.
Okay.
This man lived 90 years, and he is judged for 4 of them.
And that's a shame, since Hoover's life before entering the White House was quite simply remarkable.
He lived here with his older brother, younger sister, and both his parents.
Oh boy, what a little house.
Yeah, it's 2 rooms.
Talk about a modest background.
Hoover, a Quaker, was born in 1874 in the village of West Branch, Iowa.
His father died when Herbert was about 6, and then his mother died a few years later when he was 9.
The orphaned Bert, as he was known, was put on a train and sent 2,000 miles west to live with his uncle's family in Newberg, Oregon.
Their only son was killed in a very tragic hay wagon accident.
So Herbert was essentially sent to Oregon to kind of replace the son that his uncle and aunt had lost.
In some ways, yes, but he definitely had to earn his board here. You think you would have been happy if you were weeding onions all day?
No.
Sarah Monroe is the director of the Hoover Minthorn House in Newberg.
Was it an affectionate home?
Not particularly. I think it was very strict.
Absent the unconditional love of his birth family, Bert threw himself into work, determined to win respect and reward.
He had a deep, deep need to prove himself. And he also had an abundance of physical energy and intellectual energy, and it needed outlets.
He was accepted into the very first class of Stanford University, where he studied geology, preparation for a career as a mining engineer. Hoover's talent for turning around unproductive mines made him very much in demand the world over.
In his early 20s, he's running gold mines in Australia. In his mid-20s, he's off in China.
His relentless drive and his willingness to do whatever was necessary paid off.
He made several fortunes as early as his 20s and retired at the start of the First World War with about $3 or $4 million in assets.
Now, if Hoover's obit had been written in 1914, he would have been remembered as a talented engineer turned business magnate. But his response to World War I turned him into something far greater. When the war broke out, 120,000 Americans were stranded in Europe. Herbert Hoover, a private citizen living in London, assembled the ships to get the Americans home. Hoover followed this feat with an even more stunning one, Germany invaded Belgium and cut off its food supply. The U.S., still neutral, was reluctant to get involved.
Everyone was arguing they didn't have responsibility to feed the Belgians. Hoover said, "I'll feed them, let me through," and pretty much bullied his way through both lines.
Hoover himself convinced both the British and Germans to allow delivery of millions of tons of food to the starving Belgians.
He was dealing as though he were his own State Department.
As he put it, the feeding must go on.
Tom Schwartz is director of the Hoover Presidential Library and Museum.
How many people did Hoover and the commission end up feeding?
Between 7 and 8 million.
And he became known as the Great Humanitarian.
I still get emails and letters of people Hoover fed.
After the war, Hoover went from saving European lives to modernizing American lives. As Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Harding and Coolidge, Hoover set standards for everything from electric light sockets to milk bottles.
Get this, the dairy industry had previously had 42 different sized containers for milk. Hoover's the one who got them to do it by pint, quart, half gallon, and gallon.
And he brought order and safety to traffic lights.
He standardized it so red men stop, green men go.
He did that.
He did that.
But wait, there's more.
Hoover more or less laid the groundwork for the commercial aviation industry. He oversaw the development of what became the Hoover Dam.
And as the country's unofficial innovator-in-chief, Hoover was the very first person to appear on a live television broadcast.
He's a very modern man.
He is, yes, yes.
And in his spare time, Hoover and his wife Lou, one of the first women in America to earn a degree in geology, translated an ancient mining text from the original Latin.
I mean, they're real mining geeks.
This was published in 1912. It remains in print today.
When the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 displaced hundreds of thousands, it was a foregone conclusion that Hoover would lead the relief effort. And he rode the resulting wave of adulation to the Republican nomination for president in 1928 and a landslide victory.
The greatest landslide in American politics.
I have no fears for the future of our country. It is bright with hope.
Only 8 months later came Black Tuesday. Franklin Delano Roosevelt would sweep Hoover out of office after a single term.
The Great Depression lasted twice as long under FDR than it did under Hoover, so why does Hoover get stuck owning the Depression?
Because when Roosevelt came in, he labeled it the Hoover Depression, and he never stopped calling it the Hoover Depression throughout the whole of his presidency.
It was FDR's successor, Harry Truman, who welcomed Hoover back into public life.
And Hoover is enormously grateful for that gesture.
In 1962, on Hoover's 88th birthday, his presidential library was dedicated, only feet from the humble dwelling he'd been born in.
What more can a man do?
Former President Truman delivered remarks.
His record in his career, it is unequaled in the history of this country.
By the end of his life, he was rather proud of the fact that he was the only living American with a depression named after him.
Are you serious?
Yes, he could joke about it. But it took him a long time.
To get there,
yes.
Before he could own it.
A long time. Yeah.
The boy in these photographs is David Eisenhower. The older man is his grandfather, President and five-star General Dwight David Eisenhower.
It's normal to look up to your grandfather, but when your grandfather is a two-term president who led 5 million troops in the defeat of Hitler, that's a big deal.
It is a huge deal, and I was aware of it at a very early age.
Were you scared of him a little bit?
Yes, I mean, I wanted to be at my best around him. I felt this underlying esteem and affection.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen.
Eisenhower,
You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade.
the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II,
So help me God.
who went on to serve 8 years in the White House went home 50 years ago with his wife Mamie to their farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah, it is.
From every direction.
Yes.
He came here in retirement,
right.
But he wasn't really quiet here.
No. I don't think that presidents are allowed to retire.
And Ike was not the retiring type. In Going Home to Glory, the younger Eisenhower describes his grandfather's restless post-presidential life, raising cattle, advising his White House successors, and mentoring Republican hopefuls, including his Vice President, Richard Nixon.
My first visit, June 1st, 1967.
David's co-author is his wife, Julie Nixon Eisenhower.
And here is the bride, looking every inch a fairy tale princess.
That's right. You may remember that Richard Nixon's daughter married Ike's grandson, David.
David and Julie are looking, I would say, euphoric.
Uniting two very famous political names.
All looking very happy indeed.
So you were like the Brad and Angelina of Republican politicians' kids.
Oh, heaven forbid, no. I hope we weren't that overexposed. We certainly weren't seeking it, that's for sure.
Certainly weren't. You know, I was interested in Julie. That was it.
The two met as kids at Ike's second inaugural in 1957. Julie had had a sledding accident the day before.
And I careened up, and so I went into a tree, and I had a really big black eye. And the president leaned down to me, President Eisenhower, and he whispered, "Now, Julie, you look this way, and they won't see your black eye." And so when we were engaged later, President Eisenhower gave me this framed picture of that moment, and he said, "To Julie Nixon, who even then seems to have unwittingly gained an admirer."
The ball is one of the highlights of the social season.
They started dating in college when Mamie Eisenhower prodded David at Amherst to call on Julie 7 miles down the road at Smith.
The appearance of David and Julie had the society columns buzzing with speculation.
And this is the late 60s. The anti-war movement is at a fever pitch. You are young conservatives at liberal colleges.
Not that conservative.
I wouldn't call myself a conservative.
I would say like a moderate Republican, a middle of the road.
They say that neither they nor their namesake presidents were hardline Republicans.
We may as well say what it is, since we're not running for office. We would never get elected today, but Nixon was considered a progressive Republican.
And Eisenhower governed, in his own words, as, quote, a middle-of-the-roader.
He was a very strongly principled man who was a moderate. That's correct. Moderate because he felt that American democracy required moderation.
In their book, published by Simon & Schuster, a CBS company, both authors insist the two men had a warm relationship.
You've got the two command personalities bumping along together, and what we always say is amazing they got along as well as they did.
In the book, you write that your father's feelings towards David's grandfather bordered on hero worship.
I think so. It was very much a father-son relationship because there was that much of an age gap. He credited Eisenhower with allowing him to become a student of the world because Eisenhower was an internationalist.
Dwight D. Eisenhower died in March of 1969. He would not be able to advise the newlyweds or newly elected President Nixon.
At first it was called the Watergate Caper.
During the crisis that would engulf them all.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. And so, Richard Milhouse Nixon has resigned as the 37th President of the United States.
The Watergate years and the resignation, did that make your relationship stronger?
Well, long range, I think it did.
Yeah, we survived. Let's put it that way. I think it was a very difficult time.
Would you say that it was traumatic, or?
Oh, yeah, I think it was a very traumatic thing to go through the resignation. Because my
Surrender.
father felt he let the country down. And
Two different presidents with two very different legacies.
Eisenhower left office and left life as a highly admired figure, and your dad, for much of the country, was not admired. Did that create stress?
For us, you mean?
None.
No, that wouldn't have created stress. No. When you love someone and care about them, if they have a disaster, you don't abandon them. So we had such a strong family that, yes, it was extremely difficult, but that's the last time that you would abandon someone, is if they've had a disaster in life. Five-star flag.
Married 41 years, David and Julie Eisenhower and their 3 kids are heirs to 2 of the most famous political figures of the 20th century.
This was me in the patriotic first order dress.
This would be a White House photograph.
Their White House days are long in the past, and they're just fine with that.
Oh, yeah, and thank God it's all over, too.
Yeah.
And that, we're not recognized anymore. Or it's a privilege to tell this story. And for 4 weeks, we might be recognized in the grocery store, and then people might ask us still to spell the name.
Julie put her fingers
which just happens all the time.
It's a big relief.
Yeah.
Yes.
When the Kennedy family moved into the White House, they brought with them youth, an abundance of charm, and plenty of pets.
They've got multiple dogs. They've got Tom Kitten, the cat, parakeets named Bluebell and Maybell.
Alan Price is director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston. He says Americans were instantly taken with the family's 4-legged members. How many American kids wanted a pony after seeing Caroline with macaroni?
Everybody wants a pony after that.
But it was a gift from Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, a glamorous dog named Pushinka that set tongues wagging. Arriving with her own passport, Pushinka was the offspring of Soviet space dogs. Is she fluffy?
She is definitely a fluffy dog.
Does she have a sense of humor? She's from the Soviet Union.
I don't know. I don't think we have that recorded as well as we might.
She was fetching enough to catch the eye of Charlie, the Kennedys' roguishly handsome Welsh Terrier.
They have 4 beautiful puppies together, and life is good.
The president dubbed the offspring Pupniks, and to some, this furry first family melted hearts during a particularly frosty period.
I have directed the continued and increased close surveillance of Cuba and its military buildup.
Do you think that helped sort of thaw the cold at a very tense time?
It is a very tense time, and that human connection is tangible, it's real.
And it's part of a presidential story that captured our collective imagination.
When President Kennedy is assassinated, these pets become a big part of the memories that America holds of a time that ends so abruptly.
March 30th, 1981.
Mr. President!
John Hinckley Jr. fires 6 shots at President Ronald Reagan. A bullet lodges an inch away from his heart. Reagan is rushed into the operating room and tells his doctors, "I hope you're all Republicans."
Presenting to you the President of the United States.
Our 40th president survived, of course. And besides his toughness, the shooting showed the American people that the great communicator also had quite a sense of humor.
Letter came from Peter Sweeney. He's in the 2nd grade in the Riverside School in Rockville Center. And he said, "I hope you get well quick, or you might have to make a speech in your pajamas."
Throughout his political career, Reagan used humor to win friends, influence voters,
You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your
and slay the opposition. No one knew that better than Democratic challenger Walter Mondale.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
You wanted law and order in this town. You've got it.
A former Hollywood actor and spokesman for General Electric, Reagan knew how to make his humor seem off the cuff, except that it wasn't.
Mike Devers, in his book, said that I had a short attention span. Well, I was going to reply to that, but oh, what the hell, let's move on to something else.
You know, you can talk to any number of President Reagan's speechwriters over the years, and when they might hand him a speech, sometimes the speeches would come back with a quote or an expression or a joke that they hadn't seen before.
Turns out the Gipper had a secret comedic weapon, says John Highbush, executive director of the Reagan Library.
So all of this is the contents of his desk, the last desk he used.
2 boxes filled with the last objects sitting inside President Reagan's working desk.
Cool. All right, well, listen, I want to see this stuff.
Buried inside one of these boxes, a stack of index cards.
The president's famous one-liners, his best jokes, written on both sides. You know, this is the humor of Ronald Reagan in 3x5.
This one is titled One-Liners. Adolescence is the time when children suddenly feel responsible for answering the phone. It's pretty good. It's funny.
As unassuming as these look, they were political dynamite, a war chest of jokes. Many he wrote himself, others he borrowed.
Someone has once said that actually, as long as there are final exams, there will be prayer in schools.
I can remember when a hot story broke and the reporters would run in yelling, "Stop the chisels."
We showed some of the jokes to comedian Drew Carey. Jokes about Congress.
I've wondered at times what the 10 Commandments would have looked like if Moses had run them through the U.S. Congress.
About the Soviet Union.
What are the 4 things wrong with Soviet agriculture? Spring, summer, autumn, and winter.
And about himself.
Just to show you, this is the best one.
Just to show you how youthful I am, I intend to campaign in all 13 states.
He was a guy who wasn't afraid to make fun of himself, which was great. You know, like whatever you think the elephant in the room is, that's the thing you should be able to talk about and joke about. When I do the same thing, the first thing I do is I make a joke about the way I look.
And that kind of inoculates yourself.
Totally.
When I go in for a physical now, they no longer ask me how old I am. They just carbon date me.
Reagan's sunny disposition, his ability to joke about pretty much anything, long predated his career in politics, says his daughter, Patty Davis. She says it was a lifelong coping mechanism.
I think that everything about my father goes back to the fact of him being the child of an alcoholic. He protected himself against the unpredictability of his home by developing this sort of coating of humor over everything. I don't want to feel the pain here. I don't want to feel the unpredictability here.
Mr. President, in talking about the continuing recession tonight, you have blamed mistakes of the past, and you have blamed the Congress. Does any of the blame belong to you?
Yes, because for many years I was a Democrat.
At home, Davis also saw another side of her father's humor.
The reason that we made it a masked dance was
impersonating the distinctive, high-pitched voice of writer Truman Capote.
Idea of the domino black and white idea, but
So I'm trying to imagine Ronald Reagan imitating Truman Capote.
Yeah, and he wasn't doing it as a put down, but to me, because I was so idealistic, you know, I thought, oh, this could be, you know, it's like he's putting down, you know, a gay man or something. He really wasn't. He just thought it was funny.
Oh, and there's one more Reagan family joke. After that assassination attempt, the Gipper told Nancy, "Honey, I forgot to duck."